Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes. Let's rant with Scrapperlock using the Rebirth server. We are with our Mutation Stalker, Psyop, who's pretty close to level 30, which means we're going to be getting a new power probably this episode. Got a couple of, well, sort of like one bar to go, which we will probably complete. Um, we are on the General Z story arc, so we're going to continue with that. And this is not a let's play, but a let's rant, so let's do a rant. And today, what I want to talk about is playing the right game for you. I think this is a particularly apropos moment to record this because this weekend, as I'm recording it, it's the middle of January, and there's been about a week and a half of absolute uproar in the entire tabletop role-playing game community. If you are a part of that community, you will certainly know that the uproar is about an attempt by Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, who own the largest and most frequently played uh, property in role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, to remove their open gaming license. It's been in effect since pretty much Wizards of the Coast took over Dungeons and Dragons, and put in a new one that's much more restrictive and prevents third-party publishers from creating D&D adjacent content, whether it's stuff for a D&D game or like a D&D game. So they're basically, it was seen as them attempting to declare war on all of the third-party publishers who publish stuff for or like D&D, Castles and Crusades, Swords and Wizardry, Basic Fantasy, um, you name it, Old School Essentials, plus groups like the Kobold Press, which publishes 5e content, probably Sandy Peterson's group that does Cthulhu Mythos 5e, Pathfinder, all that stuff. Um, and so, because of that, a bunch of these companies or people are saying, like Matt Colville is going to make his own game now, so that he doesn't have to worry about having licenses yanked from him and his company being threatened. So is Kobold Press, which is one of the other big companies. And so, yeah, they're going to make their own game. And Paizo has come out and said, we're going to create an open role-playing content license called ORC that everybody can use, and it will be perpetual and irrevocable, and nobody can do this to you if you use that license. And so I don't want to get into kind of that whole mess. If you're interested, you can go online and just Google D&D space OGL space 1.1, and you will find tons of videos and tons of content and lots of articles, and you can read up on it. That's really not what I want to talk about, because this isn't a channel about D&D. It's about just tabletop role-playing games in general. And one of the reasons it's not about D&D is that long before this ever happened, I've divested myself of Dungeons and Dragons. I'm no longer subscribed to the D&D Beyond website. Long before there was a call to unsubscribe because of this, um, I haven't bought anything on their website since Tasha's Cauldron, and I sort of regret that purchase, to be honest. Not buying anything more from Wizards of the Coast. And if I had anything to do with it, my group wouldn't be playing D&D, although it's not my decision alone, and the majority, in fact, everybody but me, wants to keep playing it. So I'm playing along with them because they're my friends. And I missed another Raider Engineer because it's perpetually what I do. Um, so, uh, so I'm done with it, and I have been explicitly trying not to only talk about D&D, and if I talk about it, it's in the context of as a one of many tabletop role-playing games. And this is the point. There are many tabletop role-playing games, too many to count, and too many for me to name all of them, or even a fraction of them here. And although some of them have very similar mechanics, some of them have very different mechanics, even if they have similar mechanics, they're not identical. And different games do different things better and worse, right? Some games are really good at one thing, and some games are really good at another. And so what this video is going to be about is an encouragement by me to anybody listening to not just blindly play the most obvious game or the biggest game or the one that happens to be available in your game shop, but rather to be very deliberative about what game you decide you want to play. You want to pick a game that does well whatever it is you want out of the game, right? Um, I remember when I was on D&D Beyond, and I actually was looking over an old post of mine um, the other day, and I was just tabbed out to relook at it. I copied and pasted it into a note file, into Obsidian, and I had been responding to somebody, and we were talking about the rule of cool. So let's go back and we'll get back to what I was going to say, but let me remind you of the rule of cool, right? What the rule of cool is if it's cool in the moment, the GM should allow it because it's cool, and it'll be a great, interesting moment. In the Lazy Dungeon Master guide, which I finally purchased, Sly Flourish, the author, in one section says talking about players like to break the game, and what he meant by that is they like to do things like kill the dragon in one shot, right? Because and as a GM, you should allow it because it's awesome and they want to be awesome. And Colville has said the same thing. Players want to be awesome. Let them be awesome. And so this one person was saying, look, I need to use the rule of cool because the rules don't let me do with my character what I want to do. And so I need the rule of cool to be able to basically have my character act the way I want. Let me see if I can give you his exact quote. I can't be creative, he said, within the constructs of the existing rules. I need the rule of cool to express how my character works. Okay. What I said to him and what I argue here is if that's constantly happening, right? It's not just happening once, but it's happening quite regularly, that you have to keep breaking the written rules of the game to get your character to work the way you'd like your character to work. My suggestion to you would be you're playing the wrong game. I guarantee you that there is a game out there where the mechanics will much more fully support whatever it is that you're trying to do than the game you're playing that you have to keep breaking the rules. And so I would argue that rather than you keep breaking the rules, right? I mean, because what Sly Flourish talks about is, yes, you should allow it, but there's a risk, right? If you allow the players to kill the dragon in one shot doing some cool thing, why can't they do that cool thing in every encounter and one-shot everything from now on? And that's obviously going to break the game completely, right? Not just for one encounter. And so I missed a glowy back there, didn't I? While I was talking. I did. Let me go back and get it. Because we have to find all the files. And so that can become an issue. And so if you find that you have to keep breaking the rules and allowing rule of cool because the rules don't allow you to do what it is that you want to do, then maybe perhaps didn't I see a glowy? I thought I saw a glowing file, like a filing cabinet. Maybe perhaps what you should do is find a game that supports whatever it is that you want to do, right? So like if you want to be a superhero but the game's not letting you be a superhero, maybe you can do Champions, and that will let you be a superhero. Or if Champions rules aren't working for you and you want to do something different, maybe 5th edition D&D will work for you. Or if 5th edition D&D doesn't work, then maybe Pathfinder will work for you. Or if Pathfinder doesn't work, maybe Rolemaster will work for you. I guarantee you, whatever it is that you want to do consistently that whatever game you're playing won't let you do, there's a game out there where you can do it. If nothing else, you can go for a game that's more like Ironsworn, right, or Powered by the Apocalypse, where it's much more narrative, and what you're doing is mostly descriptive, right? So like in Ironsworn, you just pick a simple generic move, just something like Face Danger, and you just choose the appropriate stat of the 5 to roll Face Danger with, and what you roll and what the Face Danger represents is based on the narrative. And so, and here we go again with those stupid Raider engineers. But I got him before he put up a shield. And so, if the heavily mechanical games aren't working for you, then you could try one with lighter or more abstract mechanics like Powered by the Apocalypse, Dungeon World, Ironsworn, Apocalypse World, and so on. Maybe Savage Worlds would work better for you, right? For example, people who get frustrated by character classes and they have to keep doing like homebrew character classes to make their character work the way they want. Well, you can do that. That's not really rule of cool. You could do that, or you could play a game with free-form character creation, like Champions or Savage Worlds or GURPS, and you can customize your character however you want in those games, and then you can make the character actually be the way you want, right? So, like my best friend with his homebrewed Sorcerer, who was altering probabilities and stuff, that would have worked a lot better in Savage Worlds. In Savage Worlds, you alter probabilities all the time with bennies, and you can make a character with advanced luck who gets 2 extra bennies. If you play with the adventure deck, which I would have done, and I would have then recommended him to do this. If you play with the adventure deck, you can get a custom edge called Destiny's Child, where you get an extra adventure card every session. And the way I was planning on running it was I wasn't going to give adventure cards to the whole party every session. I would just you kind of do it the way the wild cards game does, and give them out like for certain things. You get 1 or 2 for the whole group per session, but Destiny's Child automatically allows you to draw 1. And so I would say, okay, take Destiny's Child, luck, improved luck, right? And then there's another edge called Common Bond, where you can give bennies to somebody else. So you'd have a character who has 5 bennies to start every session instead of 3. He can give them away to make them lucky, basically altering their probabilities. And then he's got this adventure card every single session that he can play, which can cause crazy and improbable things to happen, right? And that would really specify in game mechanics somebody who's actually changing the probabilities, instead of the way my best friend role played it, where he threw Fireball, which has nothing to do with probabilities, and says in roleplay, what are the odds that fire erupts in this room? I'm altering the probabilities to make that happen. Well, that's okay, but that's not really altering probabilities, right? That's just kind of reskinning Fireball to make it, to roleplay it that way. Whereas in Savage Worlds, you're actually altering probabilities with bennies and rerolls. Additionally, in Savage Worlds, you can take generic powers like Blast or Havoc or Boost Trait, right? Protection, Quickness, things like that are just powers, generic powers like Champions. And then like Champions, you can put the Champion's equivalent of a special effect called Trappings on them. And so you could easily make trappings for powers that are luck-based, rather than trying to reskin something much more specific like a Fireball that has technically nothing to do with luck. Yes, you can reskin all of that stuff in D&D, but the system doesn't support it in the way that Savage Worlds does, where you're supposed to do those things. And in fact, in Pathfinder for Savage Worlds, there's even a power modifier. You can pay an extra point and change the trapping as you're throwing it, right? So again, that's something that somebody who has a lot of luck might be able to do. And so my point is, oh, this was the thing, glowy, and I guess I clicked on it and forgot about it. Well, that was dumb. So what I'm saying isn't that you shouldn't play D&D, but that it may be the case that what you're trying to do would be much more easily and effectively supported by using another game system. And so what I recommend to people is not to be married to one system, right? For example, if you want to do a lot of like investigation and horror, you know what I'm going to say, something like Delta Green or Call of Cthulhu might be better suited to your interests than a game like Dungeons and Dragons. Yes, they have sort of what do you want to call it, kludged in sanity mechanics for D&D, but they don't work anywhere near as well as the sanity mechanics from Call of Cthulhu, where that's like one of the most important parts of the game, right? And where every single creature and almost every single thing you can do in the game has a known sanity check that it provokes, and it tells you how to do it, right? And it's very well specified. So instead of sort of doing the hand-wavy suggestions in the Dungeon Master's Guide for sanity, right, which are okay, and they apparently work all right, you could use Call of Cthulhu. If you want a game that's about horror and sanity, right, you might be better off, depending on how you want the game to work. If you want it to be deadlier, well, D&D 5th edition isn't all that deadly, especially once you're 3rd or 4th level. So you might want a game that's like Call of Cthulhu, where it is very deadly, and your sanity is much more fragile. And They have very explicit rules for how to go insane and recover from going insane. Delta Green's same way, right? And so this isn't to say you can't play a horror or sanity-based game in D&D, and depending on what you want to do with it, like if you want to be more superheroic about it, D&D might be better than Call of Cthulhu. And even Call of Cthulhu, right, the people who wrote that game kind of recognize this. Oh boy. And oh yeah, all right. So a shield's going to come out because I can't stop all three of these guys. They actually have put out themselves a supplement to Call of Cthulhu called Pulp Cthulhu, where you are a little more like an action hero, and you're able to, as they say, punch Cthulhu in the face and live to tell the tale, rather than just getting wiped out by these horrors. Right? You can actually fight back against them, which you can't realistically do in the base game. So if you have a bunch of players who kind of like the idea and the basic mechanics of Call of Cthulhu as a game, but they don't feel like they don't want to be as fragile and have to run all the time from the horrors, you could try Pulp Cthulhu with them, and you might like Seth Skorkowski has said that although he loves both games, he and his players prefer, and we've leveled up, prefer Call of Cthulhu. I'm sorry, Pulp Cthulhu to regular Call of Cthulhu, and they mostly play that. Right? They've picked the right game for them. And I hear a glowy. Where is it? There it is. Right? So this is the point. You want to pick the right game for you and your group. And so rather than doing things like keep house ruling Call of Cthulhu so your characters don't die so much, you could just play Pulp Cthulhu where they're a little bit hardier. Right? Or you could use another game entirely, like Savage Worlds just came out with the new version of their horror companion, and they've got their own type of fear and sanity mechanics in there. Not entirely sure I like those, actually, right? And although I was thinking of maybe because they've partnered with Chaosium to put some Cthulhu stuff in there, I was thinking, okay, if I can't convince my players to play Call of Cthulhu, maybe I can run some Call of Cthulhu stuff in Savage Worlds. But I don't actually know if I like the proposed alpha test sanity mechanics, because one of the things I really like about Call of Cthulhu, and Delta Green does this too, is there's a Cthulhu mythos skill. Everybody starts with 0. You don't know anything about that which we were not meant to know. And your maximum sanity, although you won't start the game this high, but you can gain sanity to the point that you're at your max. Your maximum sanity is 99 out of 100, right? And so when you're rolling sanity, having a 99 sanity, you have a 99% chance to stay sane and so forth, right? And if you ever go to 0 sanity, you go permanently insane and your character's retired. It's like dying. You can go insane in other ways, but that's the end of your character, just like going to 0 hit points. And traditionally in Lovecraftian horror, 0 sanity would be more the way of the character being permanently retired rather than 0 hit points, although you might die too. And what I like about the mechanic in Call of Cthulhu, and why I would rather play it, right, talking about the right game, to do Lovecraftian stuff than Savage Worlds, as much as I like Savage Worlds, is that in Call of Cthulhu, when you learn stuff about the Cthulhu mythos, not only do you take an immediate temporary sanity hit, like your current sanity will be lost probably, got to make a sanity check and try not to go crazy, but your maximum sanity goes down for every point of knowledge you gain of the Cthulhu mythos. You lose 1 point off your maximum sanity, right? And the idea is that as you learn stuff about Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth and Azathoth and these other Nyarlathotep and these other characters, as you learn that, you become less and less capable of functioning in the normal world and go slowly crazy. And so I love I don't know if it's not dramatic irony, but the irony, whatever you want to call it, of the situation where kind of the goal of your character is to learn about that which we were not meant to know, right? To solve the mysteries and learn about Cthulhu mythos. That's kind of the ultimate goal of all Call of Cthulhu characters, is to learn everything there is to know about the Cthulhu mythos. You are investigators. You're investigating, right? That's your goal. And yet, by doing so, you are slowly going insane, right? It's like by doing the thing you set out to do, you are causing your character to get closer and closer to the end of its existence. So by succeeding at the goal, you're failing at sanity, right? And so I really love that mechanic. And what I was hoping to see in Savage Worlds was a mechanism for that, an actual sanity mechanic that would replicate this effect, right? I tried to figure out how to kind of homebrew this. And one of the things I thought maybe, start with a D12 insanity and nothing, D4 minus 2 untrained in Cthulhu. And then when you gain Cthulhu, you become D4 in Cthulhu, but D10 insanity, right? And then when you gain more knowledge in Cthulhu, you become D6 in Cthulhu and D8 insanity, and then D8 in Cthulhu and D6 insanity, and eventually, and once you go down to 0 sanity, you're irretrievably insane. But that's not what they did. They just enhanced the fear table to give you a greater probability of getting phobias and permanent hindrances about your sanity, right? And that's okay, I guess, for Savage Worlds. But from the perspective of Call of Cthulhu, I don't like that there isn't a way to specify in the game mechanics that the more you learn about Cthulhu mythos, the lower your sanity drops, your maximum sanity, right? And so I was actually rather disappointed in that. And this is what I mean about playing the right game for what you want to do. If I ever ran a Call of Cthulhu game, I would... Oh, we can't take anything, so I guess we're going to take... should we take cover? Yeah, let's take cover. We need that. If I want to run a Call of Cthulhu-like game, right, I would rather run Delta Green and or Call of Cthulhu, which have these mechanics. In Delta Green, it's not called Cthulhu Mythos. It's called like the Unknown or something. But it does the same thing, right? The more you learn about the unknown, the lower your sanity goes. And so I love that mechanic. And so rather than try to graft that into Savage Worlds, what I'm arguing is we should just play Call of Cthulhu. Now, it may be that I can't convince my players to play Call of Cthulhu. Then I would argue that we should do horror, but probably not Cthulhu horror if we want to do horror, because it's not going to do what I want it to do. And trying to graft that on there is probably not going to work. Because having the D12 versus the D4 or whatever, it doesn't work the same way. And there's no mechanic for it. And then, I mean, when you roll fear checks, you don't roll sanity, you roll spirit. So now does everybody start D12 spirit? Yeah, that's not going to work either. That's like having a legendary character right at the beginning. I mean, you can't... D12 spirit is going to make the whole early part of the game too easy. Nobody's going to fail a spirit check. As a wild card, it's only going to happen when you crit fail. And so, yeah, the game mechanic doesn't support what I want it to do. Therefore, what I'm arguing is I should play the game that does support what I want it to do. And I feel like this is true for, sort of across games, right? When you are deciding what game you want to play, you want to make sure that the game's mechanics support what you want. I think that's preferable to trying to hand wave it or do rule of cool or just ignore the rule because it would be cool to ignore it here, right? If we go back to Sly Flourish's discussion about, it's just a page and a half or something, about allowing the players to, quote-unquote, break the rules, break the game for coolness reasons, right? He admits, after saying how cool this is and fun it is for them, he admits that it needs to be a one-off, right? That you have to find some way to prevent the players from doing it every single time, because doing it every single time is not cool anymore, right? Like if you one-shot a dragon, okay, that might be cool and everybody cheers, but then if every battle's a one-shot, then one-shotting the dragon isn't cool. It's just another battle, right? So how do you prevent this? And I'm going to admit I was rather disappointed by the fact, and let me just pause, these guys are white cons because I think we can't go over level 30 on this mission because it's a level 29 story arc. He sort of admits in a way that it's a bad idea because he then, says you can't let this keep happening, right? So what's his solution, right? He said, well, there's lots of possible solutions. One would be, you just ban it. Well, you don't want to do that. right? Another possible solution, I hear a glowy. Another possible solution would be to give all the future monsters a defense against whatever this is, right? So if they one-shotted the dragon with fireball, then every other monster has fire immunity or something like that. That's not fair, and I agree with both of those, right? You don't want to allow it and then ban it. It's arbitrary. And see, this is the problem, and this is why I don't agree with him actually about letting the players break the game the one time because it's cool, and I don't like rule of cool because now it's arbitrary, right? One-shotting the dragon seemed cool to the DM, or GM, so he allowed it, or she. But one-shotting the troll now is just kind of boring, so I'm not going to allow it. Now it's arbitrary. I don't like arbitrary in role-playing games. In when game masters are doing arbitrary things, I don't like that. And I don't agree with arbitrariness. I hear a glowy. Here we go. Bomb. But I do agree with him that you shouldn't now all of a sudden make everybody resistant to it. Okay. So then he said, well, you could, the right way to handle this, supposedly, is, well, let the enemies like learn about this and deploy countermeasures, right? In character countermeasures. So the example given in the book was the players players change a healing potion to like an explosion potion where if you drink it you blow up. And they convince a group of ogres to drink these explosion potions as healing potions. And they blow them up, and they all die, right, in one shot, without having to make rolls. Right? They make a persuasion check, it's cool, and the GM allows it. Okay? So that's his example. And then he says, you don't ban it for the future. What you do is, you might say, well, all the ogres in the future won't drink the potion because they've heard about it, right? They know about it now. The ogres got wise to it. Well, here's the problem. That's metagaming. That's the GM metagaming, right? Because if you're doing a rule of cool thing where you kill the dragon in one shot or you blow up the ogres with a potion, right? Where one of them drinks it and it blows up and they all die in one shot without having to make rolls because it's cool. If they're all dead, if the dragon's dead, if the ogres are dead because you've let them do a rule of cool, how would the other ogres find out about it? Are they telepathic? Did they watch a news report about it? Like, how would the next dragon know that what this party does will one-shot you, so you have to deploy a defense against it in character? So this is the problem. If the villains are in a position to discuss it, they might learn to deploy countermeasures. That's certainly true. But in many cases, the villains aren't in a position to discuss it. And therefore, you can't, in character, deploy countermeasures. A great example is, like, my best friend constantly casting slow against SWADE. And, part of the reason it worked is because they were fairly close together. And, I wanted to deploy countermeasures against it because it was making battles boring, right? It wasn't one-shotting things, but it was making it so that the SWADE were unable to effectively deploy their combat abilities because they have some bonus actions that I gave them. Like they could summon other slot as a bonus action, but then they can't do an action. They can't move. Most of their powers are melee, and they can't get into melee. The PCs can just stay out of melee with them because they've been slowed, and they're vulnerable to area effect attacks because since they were slowed when they were near each other, they can't get out of the area, right? So one of the problems with, deploy countermeasures is every one of those SWADE died. None of them escaped. They were killed by the party. And in my game, because they're kind of like dire wraiths in a sense from ROM, the comic book, in my world, in my universe, when SWADE die, they turn to ash, and then the ash sort of sublimes and vanishes within a few minutes. And one of the reasons I did that was I didn't want any evidence of the bodies. Right, when the SWADE shapeshifted in a civilized area, which I thought was going to happen a lot more than happened, I didn't want them to be able to bring the bodies to the authorities and say these guys are shapeshifters. See, they were wearing Roman Legion armor. I didn't want them to be able to prove it to the authorities. So they turned to ash, and then the ash sort of disappeared over a period of time. And so, given that every single SWADE they ever did the slow to, or in the presence of, every one of them was turned to ash, and the ash vanished. And no, they didn't go back to their home dimension. They were destroyed. There wasn't any way for the other SWADE coming in later to know that these guys could do this. So I couldn't then have them scatter ahead of time so that don't get slowed, right? Because that would be metagaming. They don't know it. My party was actually pretty good at cleaning up after themselves. And there really weren't any opportunities for the enemy to communicate what the party was up to each other, because the party basically made sure that there weren't any survivors. Any smart party is going to do that. So now if you're allowing them to one-shot kill people and doing this sort of rule of cool thing, and then the party cleans up after themselves, there isn't an in-character way to deploy countermeasures. There's no way to do it without you as the game master cheating and metagaming. And so I don't necessarily agree with that either. And again, what I would say is there are games where you can do the rule of cool stuff in mechanics sometimes, but not all the time. A great example, Savage Worlds, right? You can use adventure cards and bennies to do the really cool thing once. But you can't necessarily do it again because you're not going to have that combination of bennies and conviction dice and adventure cards. So if you want a game that has a lot of rule of cool in it, Savage Worlds might be your game because there's a mechanic for it. There are also other games. I think Fate might be one where there's a mechanic for it, kind of in Fate as well. I'm pretty sure there are other games where you almost get like a coolness token or something, right? And you can deploy it to do something awesome. And then mechanically, everybody understands that you're deploying the coolness token now, but you're not going to have that coolness token every round or every combat or every session. And so no, it's not going to work every time because it only works when you've got the coolness token or whatever it is that you've got. Right now, again, you could develop some house rule for D&D or Champions that includes a coolness token, or you can play a game like Savage Worlds where you get a conviction die, right? Or you get adventure cards, or you have bennies, right? And you can use the mechanics in the game. Where is this? That are meant for that. How am I missing this? Is this in the wall? Oh no, there it is. So what I'm saying here, folks, is there are tons and tons of role-playing games out there. Tons. With all kinds of cool mechanics. And I guarantee that whatever it is that you and your friends want to do, that you keep having to break the rules of the game you're playing in order to do it, you could find a game where you can do it within the mechanics and it's all specified properly and it works, and you'll probably be a lot happier. Right? I honestly think if he would give it a chance, my best friend would love Savage Worlds. He would love the bennies and the rerolls. He would like the fact that you can, like, the GM can give you bennies for doing cool stuff. Right? So then he would, try to earn more bennies. I think he would like the conviction dice and all of that. I think he would love the adventure deck. And I think if he had given it a chance, look, I didn't even know Savage Worlds existed when we first started playing 5th edition, but I think if he would give it a chance, he would find that his Hassan character, who's the random manipulator of, random chance, would work so much better in Savage Worlds. There are so many edges he could use to build his character just the way he wants it. Instead, he had to homebrew something in D&D, and it never really completely worked. and it was a kludge, right? Now, I mean, I think he was happy with the way the character played, but let me give you a great example. His special effect of his firebolt was that he was throwing magical flaming cards at people, and they were hitting. Well, guess what? In Savage Worlds Deadlands, there's a huckster character where the entire trapping of the character is using magical decks of cards, and it's all specified, right? And you can actually deal with a demon using a deck of cards and drawing cards in your mind or whatever to steal power points from it. And all of the special effects, all the trappings are meant to be card based, magical cards, and a deck of magical cards springs into your hands. I mean, I think he would love playing a huckster. That would make his character concept completely specified within the rules, and everything is built. There are special edges that give them improved probabilities on drawing cards from decks and gambling and all that stuff because they're hucksters, right? So there's like a whole entire almost class, but it's not a class, it's just edges that you can take if you're a huckster, combined with edges from the base Savage Worlds game. You could build something that's much more exactly what he wanted than trying to kludge something into the Sorcerer class from D&D. Right? And so what I'm suggesting is you might be much more happy, might be much happier playing a game that is already built to do what you want it to do. And I think a lot of people would be happier with a less mechanically specified game. People who really want to do much more heavy narration would do much better to play Starforged or Ironsworn or a Powered by the Apocalypse game, which is designed for that, than to try to do the heavy narration in a game like Champions, which was designed to be more mechanical and crunchier, right? And so, yes, you can play any game any way you want, right? You can house rule anything. You can throw out rules. That's how they were made. These games are made to be flexible and modular and all of that. And that's very much true. But my feeling is when I'm doing this is that I often feel like I'm fighting the game system to get it to work the way I want. So, for example, I stopped playing Ironsworn, not because it's a bad game, but because it wasn't as mechanically specified as some of the other games, particularly in combat. I kept feeling like I was constantly fighting Ironsworn and Starforged to get the games to do what I want them to do. Meanwhile, playing like Mythic GM Emulator with Savage Worlds, I don't feel like that at all. I feel like it's doing exactly what I want it to do. I'm not entirely sure I've got the right setting for myself because I feel like I'm not getting enough combat. And I'm doing a lot more just sort of investigation, which is okay, but it wasn't what I intended to necessarily do. But that's a setting issue, not a rules issue. But I feel like the combination of using Mythic to get the prompts and then skill checks and dramatic tasks and combat in Savage Worlds is giving me what I wanted, right? So rather than... originally, I was trying to homebrew something in Ironsworn. I tried to homebrew combat in Ironsworn to get it to work more like, a D&D game or a Champions game or a Savage Worlds game. And I tried to homebrew a bunch of the moves and make new moves for myself. And I got partway through doing that, and I realized this is silly. What I've been trying to do, eventually I tried to do what I called Savage Ironsworn, where I was going to try to merge some of the mechanics of Savage Worlds with Ironsworn. And what I realized was the reality is that Ironsworn is just not for me. I was trying to get it to do things. Yes, you can technically do them, but it's not great at them. And Savage Worlds is much better at them. Frankly, Champions would be too. Any more mechanically specified game would be better at them. So the solution to me wasn't to keep house ruling and changing Ironsworn. It was go ahead and play the game that is going to fit what I want to do. And I'm much happier. Right now, I still use Ironsworn's oracles to generate prompts. I use their action and theme oracle all the time. I'm using some of the Delve oracles and stuff to, like when I go into an area, to see what it's like. So I went into a haunted house, and I said, okay, what themes? And there's a whole deck of themes so you can get the cards, and I just picked out like 3 or 4 themes that made sense, and 2 or 3 areas that made sense, and I shuffled them up, and I drew out 2 of them, and then I used the random tables on those cards to give me sort of prompts as what I was seeing inside the inn, right? So I was still using pieces of it, the oracles, but the game mechanics come entirely from Mythic and SWADE, because that does what I wanted, right? So instead of fighting Ironsworn to get it to do what it doesn't do well, but I wanted it to do, I'm using Mythic and Ironsworn to do what I want, and I'm having a much more enjoyable experience out of it, right? So again, yes, you can homebrew anything, right? And if you really love a game system like Champions, I mean, I could homebrew almost anything in Champions. I know Champions like the back of my hand. You guys aren't going to do anything. You aren't going to do well trying to go vertically for me anymore because I have hover now. I can homebrew almost anything in Champions. I'm really good at Champions. I'm better at Champions than anything else. I'm better at the hero system than anything else. The hero system's a generic system, and you technically could get it to do almost anything, right? But it's better at some things and not so great at others. Like, I don't think the hero system would do horror or sanity well at all. There is no real sanity mechanic in it. Ego is not a substitute, and there's really no way to specify that. I don't think it does that well at all. I also think, although you can do more normal, non-super characters, it doesn't do it well. And it does a much better job of super-powered characters. Because it's Champions! And so, although the hero system does have, agent rules and stuff, I honestly don't think they work as well. And if you want to do agents, you'd be better off doing something like Delta Green, which has actual agents in it. Or Savage Worlds with no powers, just edges. Right? And then you could have some, like, normal human agents, and I think it would work great. Versus Champions, where, the games sort of expect you to be super powered, and not being super powered is a bit of a kludge that they put into hero system to try and appeal to people who didn't like superheroes. It doesn't work that well, in my opinion, right? It works. There's some stuff like Ninja Hero where you get the sort of kung fu martial arts. It does that fairly well. That's heroic rather than super heroic. But if you're trying to do more normal things, you can do it in Champions, but it's not meant for that, right? That's not how the game was designed initially. It doesn't do it as well as the games that were designed for you to play a normal person like Call of Cthulhu or Delta Green or something like that, or certain settings of Savage Worlds. And so what I'm arguing here is that you should try to, you might have more fun and be more satisfied with a game that is actually specified to let you do what you want to do than to keep having to ignore the rules and do rule of cool to let you do the things you want to do that the game system technically doesn't allow. And then you don't have the sly flourish problem of, well, how do I allow it here and not every other time? You don't have that problem if you're playing a game where the mechanics allow it and there's a mechanical way of allowing it because you can allow it, right? You don't have to say, well, how do I allow bennies here and not somewhere else? You don't have to do that. Savage Worlds has the rules for bennies built in. Right? How do I allow the adventure deck cards to be played here and not somewhere else? You don't have to worry about that. They're built in. You can only play one adventure card per session. Right? No matter how many of them you hold. So even if you're following the regular adventure deck rules and giving everybody a card out at the beginning of the session, you can only play one each, even if they're holding 5. Because at the higher levels, at the higher ranks, you can hold more than one. You can draw more than one, but you can only play one. Right. Again, unless you have the Destiny's Child Edge, then you can play an extra one. So, there are rules for it, and the game expects it, and the rules are designed to account for it, and so doing it doesn't break anything, and you don't have to say, well, what can I do to make sure that they can play adventure cards against the dragon, but not against the goblins? It won't break the game to play the adventure cards against the goblins because the adventure cards are part of the game, you see. When you're doing rule of cool, right, when you're just allowing stuff because it's cool to break the game now, then you don't have a good rules as written kind of a reason why you can allow it once and not another time, and that's when it becomes arbitrary. Great. And that's when it becomes much harder, I think, as a GM to avoid things like metagaming and that sort of stuff. You don't have to metagame in a game that allows you to do the things that you want to do. You just do them, right? Just like D&D, like having spellcasters blasting spells all over the place with cantrips and everything, right? If you have a game like, say, Savage Worlds, base Savage Worlds, default Savage Worlds does not have cantrips, right? You can only cast a spell with power points, period. Right now they changed it in Pathfinder, Savage Pathfinder, but they do have cantrips, but they don't affect combat, right? So if you're playing a game where you want your casters to be able to fire off their spells every round of combat, no matter what, right? You want a game with cantrips. And you don't want to play a game where you have to spend endurance and champions or power points, because there will come a time when you can't do it. And if you don't want there to ever come a time when you can't do it, then champions or Savage Worlds, base Savage Worlds anyway, may not be your game. And so rather than trying to sort of homebrew champions so that you don't have, so that if you have zero endurance, you can keep doing stuff without spending stun as endurance, just play a game that allows cantrips. You see what I mean? So I think that it's perfectly fine in a given moment for a GM to allow something unusual because it's cool and cinematic. I'm not saying GMs shouldn't do that. What I am saying is, if you're like this other person who in his post said that he regularly can't be creative within the constructs of the existing rules because he needs, and therefore he needs the rule of cool to express how his character works. If that's happening a lot to you in a game, you might want to think of a different game. And I encourage people to go back to the beginning where we were talking about this OGL and how who knows how it's going to turn out. At the time of recording, it's unclear because Wizards of the Coast hasn't actually released an OGL. They've had to backpedal because of all the outcry. The concern has been whether the new open gaming license or closed gaming license that Wizards produces might stop everyone from producing the games that they've been producing, right? And require third-party publishers to yank from the shelves the games they produced in the past that are similar to D&D, right? There are lots of games out there that aren't anything like D&D that you could try. And I urge people to try them and see if you like them and see if they are a more comfortable fit for you and your group, right? I think actually my group would probably get a real kick out of Savage Worlds. I think they would love the bennies and the re-rolling, and I would probably be very free with the bennies and give them a lot of bennies to re-roll with. And I think they would really enjoy the cinematic nature of the game, and they would have a lot of fun. And I think I would enjoy running it and stuff. But they've never tried it, so they don't know, right? So try these other games. You might find that the other games have a better fit for your playstyle, and you might be much happier playing Ironsworn. Much happier playing Call of Cthulhu, much happier playing Swords and Wizardry, much happier playing Maze Rats, which is a much simpler game, right? It's a very, some of these rules-like games, all you do is have stats. You don't even have skills, and you just roll the stat that is the most appropriate. So if you're trying to do stealth, make a dex roll. It's obviously dex. If you're trying to like lift a gate, or open a stuck door, make a strength roll, right? There's no athletics, acrobatics, stealth. They don't have any of that. You just roll the stat that is most appropriate, right? And it's super simple. And then you can kind of do almost anything, because since they don't have anything specified, whatever you come up with, the GM can just have you make a roll on one of the three most, or Ironsworn's that way, right? It's just roll wits, roll shadow, roll heart, roll iron, roll edge. Whatever is most appropriate when you face danger. And you can play the whole game just facing danger and rolling the appropriate stat if you want. You don't have to do any of the other moves. And I think a lot of the Powered by the Apocalypse games, pretty much that's the way they are. You just make a stat roll. And you either get a strong hit, a weak hit, or a miss, right? And then you build the narrative that way. And so then you don't need Roll of Cool, because it's very rules light, so you can kind of do whatever you want. So if you want a rules light game where you can do whatever you imagine, and you don't have to worry about whether the rules allow it, that might be your jam. And don't get a big rules heavy game like Pathfinder, where even whether you can scratch your nose or not is a roll, right? And I'm joking about that, but Pathfinder is very crunchy and very specified. Everything is coded out, right? Everything is specified. That doesn't make it better or worse. It just depends on what your group likes, right? So some groups like it all to be specified and they want to follow the rules, and other groups prefer it not to be specified and they just want to have a story game, right? And both of those are fine, but if you take Pathfinder with all the mechanical specification and say, well, now we're going to play a story game with it, it's possible to do, but it might be a better fit to use Ironsworn or Dungeon World, rather than Pathfinder. So I urge people to try these other games and see what's the best fit for you. And rather than trying to force the square peg into the round hole, find a square hole for your square peg. That's my suggestion. So hopefully that was useful for people. Until next time, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been City of Heroes on the Rebirth server.